I pay $2,800 a month to live in a shack behind the house I built brick by brick. My son calls it a contribution. He says if I work harder, maybe he'll consider lowering the rent. One night, I brought a tray of drinks to his anniversary party in that very house. When I dropped a glass, he looked at me in front of 20 guests and said, "Kneel down and pick up the pieces." I did, but that night I started making a decision he never expected. If you made it past that first minute, thank you, it means something. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from your city? Your country, I want to know. Quick note, some elements of this story are fictional added for clarity and depth. Names and settings are coincidental, but what this story is trying to say to you, that part is worth your time. The wood remembers everything. That is the first thing an old carpenter learns if he's paying attention. Press your palm flat against a beam you shaped 30 years ago, and you can still feel the grain running beneath your skin like a pulse. Oak holds its warmth longer than pine. Cherry has a smell that never quite leaves even after the finish dries and the seasons turn, and the family living inside forgets the man who put it all together. My name is Silas Vance. I am 62 years old. My hands are rough in the way that only decades of honest work can make them. Calloused across the palm, scarred at the knuckles, stained faintly along the nail beds with the ghost of walnut stain that no amount of scrubbing ever fully removes. I built houses for 31 years. I built furniture staircases, window frames, wraparound porches. I built things meant to last. And I built that house, the one on Meridian Street in Savannah, Georgia. 3 stories of Gothic revival architecture, dark brick and arched windows, a steep pitched roof with decorative trim I carved by hand over the course of one full summer. The kind of house that makes people slow their cars down when they drive past. The kind of house that gets photographed by tourists who mistake it for a historical landmark. Every window frame in that house I shaped. Every door I hung. The staircase banister each turned spindle. My hands. The wide plank heart pine floors in the front parlor. The built-in bookshelves in the study. The kitchen cabinetry with the hand-cut dovetail joints that my son never once noticed, and my wife noticed every single day. Margaret noticed everything. On that particular morning, in the spring of 2022, I was in the small workshop I kept in the far corner of the backyard. The yellow light from the old work lamp spilled through the workshop's single window, onto the damp grass outside, the way it always did when I started early. I was working on a cabinet door, running a hand plane along the edge to get the fit right, listening to the birds start up in the live oaks and the distant sound of traffic beginning on the highway 2 miles east. That was when I heard the back door of the house bang open. Small feet on the porch steps. Then the creak of the workshop door, and there was Arlo. My grandson was 4 years old that spring. He had his father's dark hair, and mercifully his mother's disposition. He came into the workshop the way he always did, without knocking, without ceremony, dragging a little wooden stool to the corner where he liked to sit and watch. He propped his chin in both hands and studied what I was doing, with the focused seriousness that only a 4-year-old can bring to watching someone else work. "Is that going to be a door?" he asked. "Already is a door," I said. "Just convincing it to behave like one." He thought about that for a moment, then nodded as though it made perfect sense. That was Arlo. He accepted the logic of working men without needing it explained twice. He was the best part of my mornings. He had been the best part of my days since the spring, when everything else changed. Margaret passed on a Tuesday in March of 2022. Lung cancer diagnosed 14 months before moved faster than anyone expected in the final 3. She had been a small woman her whole life, small and precise and absolutely immovable when she had made up her mind about something. In the last week, she seemed to get smaller still, like the illness was slowly returning her to something essential. But her grip when she took my hand never loosened. The night before she died, she was lucid in a way she hadn't been for days. She looked at me with those dark eyes that had been looking at me for 34 years, and she said, "Promise me you'll keep this family together, Silas, no matter what happens. Promise me." I promised her. I had never broken a promise in my life. I did not intend to start. 3 months after we buried Margaret, Garrett came to find me in the workshop. My son was 36 years old, well-dressed in the way that men are when they want to be taken seriously, and wearing an expression I had not seen on him before, concerned, measured, the expression of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say. He told me the family doctor had flagged something in my last routine blood work, something to do with my heart. Irregular readings, nothing certain yet, but enough that I should think about getting my affairs in order sooner rather than later. He said it gently. He said he was only thinking of my well-being. He said he wanted to make sure that if anything happened to me, the house would be protected, the family would be secure. And then he said the other thing. He said that if the property remained in my name without a clear plan in place, he might need to move Arlo to his mother-in-law's place in Atlanta, just temporarily, just until the legal situation was settled. He said it the way you say something you'd rather not say, with his eyes slightly away from mine, his voice carefully neutral. Just a practical concern, just a contingency. Atlanta was 4 hours from Savannah, 4 hours from this workshop in this backyard, and these mornings, with a small boy on a wooden stool, asking about door frames. I thought about Margaret's hand in mine. I thought about the promise I made in that room that smelled of antiseptic and cut flowers. I thought about Arlo's voice saying, "Is that going to be a door?" Like it was the most natural question in the world. 2 weeks later, I signed the deed. I remember the exact weight of the pen. I remember the notary's fingernail tapping the signature line. I remember looking up at Garrett when it was done, at his face which had relaxed into something I read as relief, and now understand was something else entirely. I didn't know then what I had handed over along with the title. I thought I was signing a piece of paper. I thought I was keeping a promise. I didn't know I was signing over every last thing I had left to stand on. What I know now, and what took me far too long and far too much to learn, is that Garrett understood exactly what that signature meant from the moment he first suggested it. I walked out of that notary's office believing I had done right by my family. My son walked out knowing he had gotten everything he came for. And the house I built with these two hands no longer had my name on it. I built that storage shed in the summer of 1987. I remember the weekend I put it up. A 2-day project at the far end of the backyard. Nothing fancy, just a practical structure to keep my tools dry and organized. Corrugated tin roof, treated lumber frame, a single small window on the south-facing wall so I could see what I was doing without running an extension cord for a lamp. I built it to hold saws and paint cans and the kind of organized clutter that accumulates when a man spends his life working with his hands. 35 years later, on a gray October afternoon, in 2022, I stood in front of that shed holding a brand new key. The key was shiny in the way that new keys always are. Machine cut, no character to it yet. Garrett had handed it to me that morning, along with a folded piece of paper. Both items delivered with the brisk efficiency of a landlord who has done this before and would prefer not to make it awkward. He told me the shed had been cleaned out and set up. He mentioned almost as an afterthought that the arrangement was subject to review. If I kept up with the property work and didn't make things difficult, he said he might be able to revisit the numbers down the road. He told me I would find everything I needed in there. What I found was a single bed pushed against the east wall, a box fan on the floor, and the smell of a place that has been closed up for years. That particular combination of damp wood, old motor oil, and decades of accumulated dust that no amount of airing out fully removes. The window I had cut into the south wall, the one I was so practical about in 1987, let in a thin rectangle of fading light. The ceiling was low enough that I had to angle my head slightly when I walked under the crossbeam, 8 feet by 10 feet. That was the size of it. I set my bag down on the bed and stood there for a moment taking stock. It was Melody who brought the paperwork. My daughter-in-law was 35 years old, precise in her appearance and in her manner, the kind of woman who color codes her calendar and considers small talk an inefficient use of time. She appeared at the shed door within the hour, holding a single sheet of paper in a plastic sleeve, and explained that she had put together a summary of the household arrangement going forward. She called it a care contribution agreement. The number at the top was $2,800 per month, due on the first non-negotiable, not inclusive of meals or personal household supplies. She had itemized it $800 for lodging, $600 for utilities, $400 for shared internet and cable access, $500 for general property maintenance contribution, $500 for household services. I looked at the paper. Then I looked past Melody's shoulder at the house. The lights in the parlor were on, through the tall arched window, the one I had framed by hand, and the one whose proportions I had calculated on graph paper on a cold November night in 1993. I could see the back of the leather armchair I had built in 2005. Garrett was sitting in it. His feet were up. He was watching television. That chair had taken me 11 days to build. I had steamed the wood for the curved armrests myself, bent it slowly over a form I constructed just for that purpose, sanded it through 6 grits until the surface was smooth as river stone. Garrett had never once mentioned it. My pension came to $3,140 a month. After $2,800, I had $340, remaining to cover my blood pressure medication, which ran about $80 gas for the truck, roughly $60, and everything else. Food, clothing, any unexpected expense that life tends to generate without asking permission first. I signed Melody's paper. I signed it because Arlo's bedroom window was on the 2nd floor, directly above the shed, and most mornings I could hear him moving around up there before he came downstairs. I signed it because the alternative Garrett had made clear in the same conversation where he handed me the key was that if things became difficult, if I made things difficult, he would need to reconsider Arlo's living arrangements. His wife's family in Atlanta had more space, more stability. It would be better for the boy. So I signed. The work assignment started the following week. Garrett had a list handwritten on yellow legal paper of maintenance tasks that needed doing around the property. Gothic revival houses of that age require constant attention. Gutters weatherproofing the slow, inevitable battle against moisture that old brick fights year-round. I knew every inch of what needed doing, because I had been doing it for decades. Now, I did it on a schedule someone else set for a house that no longer carried my name. Caulking around the 2nd floor windows, repainting the iron fence along the front, clearing the downspout that backed up every time it rained, replacing 3 sections of the porch railing that had finally given out after 30 years of Savannah humidity. I did not complain. I told myself I was being useful. I told myself this was temporary, that things would settle into a reasonable shape eventually the way lumber settles after it acclimates to a new environment. One evening in late October, I was cleaning up after patching a section of the garden wall when Garrett stepped outside to take a phone call. He didn't look at me. He walked to the far side of the yard, and I heard his voice drop to that low, controlled register that men use when they are discussing something they do not want overheard. I caught fragments. A city name I didn't recognize, a number that meant nothing to me without context, and the phrase "I need more time" repeated twice, with the particular weariness of someone who had said it before and had not been believed. He went back inside without acknowledging that I was there. That night around 9 o'clock, Garrett came to the shed. He knocked once, opened the door without waiting, and told me in a pleasant and entirely neutral voice that if my contribution payment was even 1 day late in any given month, he would need to revisit whether this living arrangement was working for everyone involved. He left before I could respond. The door swung shut behind him. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and thought about Margaret's hand in mine and the promise I had made her. Then I looked up at the shed's small window. Through it at an angle, I could just make out the warm yellow light coming from Arlo's room on the 2nd floor. I stayed, the way I would keep staying month after month, long after I should have understood what staying was costing me. My daughter has her mother's eyes, not just the color, dark brown, almost black in certain light, but the quality of them, the way they take in a room without appearing to move. Margaret used to do the same thing, that particular stillness of a woman who is watching and understanding far more than anyone around her suspects. I used to find it comforting in my wife. In the winter of 2022, standing at the kitchen sink, washing dinner dishes in the house I had built and no longer owned, I found it in my daughter and felt something closer to grief. Ilara was 28 that year. She was the younger of my 2 children, quieter than Garrett had ever been, more careful with her words, the kind of person who thinks 3 times before speaking once. She had married Daniel 3 years earlier. He was a good man, an accountant, steady and decent, in the way that steady, decent men sometimes go unnoticed in a room. They lived in the house because Garrett had invited them to stay after the wedding, and because Ilara, I understood this only later, had her own reasons for wanting to remain close. On the surface, she gave Garrett nothing to object to. She did not argue with him. She did not question the arrangement that had put her father in the backyard shed. She moved through the house, quietly spoke when spoken to, and kept whatever she was thinking behind those eyes that never quite gave it away. but I watched her the way old men watch the things they cannot fix. I noticed that she always carried her phone face down, not the casual habit of someone who has lost interest in the screen, but the deliberate positioning of someone who does not want a particular angle of view. When Garrett walked through a room, her hand would move to the phone before she had consciously registered his presence, turning it over in one smooth, practiced motion. I noticed this for weeks before I understood it was a pattern. I noticed, too, the way she stood when Garrett spoke sharply to me. She would position herself at the edge of whatever room it happened in, the doorway to the kitchen, the far end of the hall, and her expression would not change. But something behind her eyes would pull tight like a wire being wound one turn further than was comfortable. She never intervened. She never said a word. But she was always there, and she was always watching. One afternoon in December, Garrett left to meet someone across town. The sound of his car pulling out of the driveway had barely faded when Alara appeared in the kitchen. She moved to the counter beside me, picked up a dish towel, and began drying the glasses I had set in the rack. For a minute, neither of us spoke. The kitchen was quiet in the way that houses get quiet when the person who controls the atmosphere has left it. Then she said quietly, and without looking up from the glass in her hands, "Dad, don't do anything. It's not time yet." I turned to look at her. "Not time for what?" She shook her head just slightly. The same gesture Margaret used to make when she had said everything she intended to say on a subject. I stood there with my hands still in the dishwater and tried to read her face. There was nothing to read. She had learned too well, or inherited too much, to let what she was thinking show when it mattered. It brought back a memory I had not examined carefully until that moment. 6 months before I signed the deed, Ilara had called me on a Wednesday evening. I remembered it because she so rarely called without a reason, and her voice that night had carried an edge I was not used to hearing from her. She told me not to sign anything Garrett brought me. She said Garrett was not the man I thought he was. She said she had seen things, she did not specify, that worried her deeply. I had listened politely and told her she was being protective, which was understandable given her mother had just passed, and that Garrett was simply trying to help the family get its affairs in order. I told her not to worry. She had gone quiet on the phone. Then she said carefully, "Okay, Dad." And that was the end of it. Standing at the kitchen sink that December afternoon, I understood that her silence on that phone call had not been agreement. It had been the decision of a woman who recognized that the argument was already lost and chose to save her energy for something else. What that something else was, I would not learn for a long time. Later on, a night when Garrett was in a worse mood than usual and had said something to me in front of Daniel that no son should say to his father, I found Alara in the hallway afterward. I asked her why Daniel never said anything, why she never said anything, why no one in that house ever pushed back. She looked at me for a moment. Then she told me in a voice so flat it frightened me a little that Garrett had made something clear to her a while back. He had told her that he was in possession of documentation regarding a financial matter involving Daniel, and old debt details she did not specify, and that if she ever made trouble, the documentation would find its way to Daniel's employer and to the relevant parties in their personal life. She said Garrett had been very calm when he explained this. Very pleasant even. I started to say something about lawyers, about calling his bluff, about the fact that this sounded like the kind of thing that was itself illegal. She cut me off gently. "I know," she said. "I've already talked to Uncle Sterling." Sterling was my younger brother, 63 years old, an attorney out of Atlanta, the kind of man who had been methodical and precise since childhood, and had only become more so with age. I had not spoken to him in months. I had not thought to call him. Ilara said Sterling had told her the same thing she already knew, that what she had was not enough, that Garrett would hire lawyers and bury any family complaint in paperwork and delays. That to make something stick, she needed evidence of actual criminal conduct, not a family dispute, not hurt feelings, not the word of a daughter against her brother. Hard evidence, the kind that prosecutors find interesting. She said this without bitterness, the way you state a problem you have already accepted and are working around. The sound of Garrett's car came up the driveway. Her hand found mine for 1 second, a brief, deliberate pressure, and then she stepped back and picked up the dish towel again, and was simply drying glasses when the back door opened. I did not understand what she meant by not yet, but I understood standing there with dishwater cooling around my wrists that my daughter was not waiting because she had run out of options. She was waiting because she was building something. Melody never called me dad, not once in the 6 years she had been married to my son. Not father, not even the stilted formality of Mr. Vance that some daughters-in-law fall back on when they want to signal distance without being rude. She called me Silas, every time without variation in the same tone she used when she was talking to a shoe tractor or a service representative on the phone. Efficient, transactional, a name, not a relationship. By the first week of January 2023, I had been living in the shed for 3 months. The arrangement had settled into its shape the way bad arrangements do, not through acceptance exactly, but through the accumulation of days until the abnormal begins to feel structural. I knew which board in the shed floor creaked. I knew that the box fan needed to be angled precisely northeast, or it just pushed hot air in a circle. I knew that if I was quiet enough in the early mornings, I could hear Arlo moving around in his room above the house before anyone else was awake. On a Tuesday morning in January, Melody called me into the front parlor. She was sitting in the leather armchair, not the one I had built, but the wingback she had brought into the house after the wedding. Upholstered in a deep burgundy fabric she had selected from a catalog. She had her tablet in her lap and her reading glasses on, and she looked up at me over the frames with the expression of someone who is about to conduct a review. She told me that now that the initial period was behind us, she wanted to go through the contribution agreement in detail. She turned the tablet toward me. On the screen was a document she had formatted with a header that read, Vance Residence Household Agreement, complete with a small decorative border. I noted she had not used the word family anywhere in the title. $800 for lodging, $600 for utilities, electricity, water, gas, $400 for shared services meaning internet and cable, which I did not use except to occasionally check the weather. $500 for what she called general property maintenance contribution, $500 for household services. I looked at that last line for a moment. Household services. I had spent the previous week on my hands and knees re-caulking the grout lines in the downstairs bathroom. The week before that, I had replaced a section of the copper guttering along the east face of the house, which required 3 trips up a ladder in 38-degree weather. I asked her what household services meant exactly. She told me it covered the overhead costs of running a shared residence. She said it with the particular confidence of someone who has prepared for the question and found the preparation sufficient. I did the arithmetic in my head the way I always have. $3,140 coming in each month from the pension, $2,800 going back out, $340 remaining. My blood pressure medication was $80 a number, I knew without checking, because I had been managing the prescription for 4 years. Gas for the truck ran $60 give or take, depending on how much driving the week required. That left $200 for everything else. Food I bought and kept in a small cooler in the shed. Any clothing I needed, any tool that wore out. Any expense that did not ask permission before arriving. $200. I did not say any of this out loud. I picked up the pen she had placed on the side table and signed where she indicated. As I was setting the pen down, she mentioned in the same even voice that personal hygiene items were not included in the household services line. Soap, shampoo, toothpaste. Those were individual expenses. She said it the way you say something self-evident, as though she was doing me a courtesy by clarifying it before there was any confusion. I thought about the oak base cabinet in the kitchen, the one I had spent 3 weeks building in the fall of 2009, mortise and tenon joints at every corner. I had cut each one by hand because I did not trust the router for work that precise. The finish was a Danish oil I had applied in 5 coats over 2 weeks, rubbing each coat out with steel wool before the next went on. It had a drawer that still opened and closed with the smooth resistance of good craftsmanship, the kind that does not loosen with age but settles into itself. Melody set her coffee cup on it without a coaster. I looked at the window. While she was reviewing something on her tablet, her expression shifted. It was brief, a slight compression of the brow, a tightening around the eyes, before she closed the application and set the tablet face down on the arm of the chair. She did it in one practice motion, the screen angled away before she looked up. I had seen Alara do something similar with her phone. In Melody, the gesture carried a different weight. From the hallway, I heard Garrett's voice drop suddenly. He had taken a call a few minutes earlier and stepped toward the back of the house. Now the words were too low to follow, but the cadence was familiar, the clipped, compressed rhythm of a man managing something he cannot fully control. I heard the name of a city, Atlanta, and then a number I did not catch, and then the phrase, "I told you, I need more time," spoken with the flat insistence of someone repeating themselves to an audience that has stopped finding the explanation satisfying. The back door opened and closed. He had gone outside to finish the conversation. Melody did not react. She picked up her coffee and looked at something on the far wall with the careful neutrality of a woman who has learned not to appear interested in her husband's phone calls. That evening, she slid a utility bill under the shed door. $340. The name on the account was Garrett T. Vance. My son's name on a bill for a house I had built, paid with money I had earned for electricity that ran through wiring. I had rooted myself in 1997. I sat on the edge of the bed with the bill in my hands and looked at his name where mine should have been. When I tried to recall Melody's expression, when I had signed the agreement that morning, what I remembered was not satisfaction exactly. It was the particular composure of someone who has completed a step in a longer process. A transaction finished a box, checked a piece, moved into position. I did not know what position. I did not know what process. But I had spent 30 years working with materials that do not lie, and I had learned to recognize when something is being built, even when I cannot yet see the shape of what it will become. There is a kind of silence that only men who have lost but not yet quit understand. It is not the silence of peace, and it is not the silence of defeat. It sits somewhere between the two, in the place where a man keeps going through the motions of a day, because stopping would require him to look directly at something he is not yet ready to see. I had been living inside that silence for 6 months by the time the spring of 2023 came around, and I had gotten good at it the way you get good at anything you practice long enough without meaning to. The workshop in the corner of the backyard had become mine again, in a way the shed never would be. Garrett had no use for it. He had never shown any interest in working with his hands, had found the smell of sawdust vaguely irritating since adolescence, and so it remained the one space in that yard where I could move without feeling like a tenant being watched by a landlord. I kept it clean. I kept my tools in the same order they had always been in. I kept myself busy there in the late afternoons, when the light came through the single window at the angle that was best for close work. That spring, I was building a bird cage. It had started as a simple project, something to occupy the hours, something to give my hands a purpose that was mine and not Garrett's. But it had become more than that over the first week of working on it. I was using cherry wood, the same stock I had kept back from a larger project years earlier, a board so fine-grained and consistent that I had never found the right use for it until now. I was taking my time with it. Each vertical bar required individual attention, measured and shaped and sanded to a smoothness that had no practical necessity. No one judges the finish on a birdcage bar, but that I attended to anyway because that was how I had always worked. Every cut I thought about Arlo. He came in through the workshop door at his usual hour the way he had done almost every afternoon since he was old enough to cross the yard without supervision. He had his own stool in the corner, a low 3-legged thing I had knocked together from scrap pine the previous fall, sized exactly right for a 5-year-old who needed to sit at a height where he could watch without being underfoot. He climbed onto it with the practiced ease of someone settling into a familiar chair and propped his chin in his hands. "What kind of wood is that?" he asked. "Cherry," I said. He considered this. Like the fruit. Same name, different thing. He leaned forward slightly and sniffed with the solemn concentration of someone conducting an official inspection. "It smells good. Cherry always does." He watched me work for a few minutes in the comfortable silence that existed between us, the kind that does not need to be filled. Then, "Can I try?" I handed him a piece of scrap and a square of fine sandpaper and showed him the direction of the grain. He went at it with both hands tongue pressed to his upper lip, the way children do when they are taking something seriously. The late afternoon light came through the knotted window glass and lay in pale rectangles across the floor, shifting slowly as the sun moved. I found myself thinking about Margaret. She had been a small woman who occupied her spaces with more presence than her size suggested. In the evenings after dinner, she would sit at the kitchen table. Not the parlor, not the living room, but the kitchen. Because she said that was where the actual life of a house happened, with a stack of workbooks and a red pen tutoring the neighborhood children who came 2 and 3 at a time. She charged them almost nothing. Some families paid her in garden vegetables. Some paid her in the particular currency of small towns, which is to say they paid her in gratitude that found its way back to her in other forms over the years. She did that for decades. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, the kitchen filled with children and pencils and the sound of Margaret's voice, patient and precise, explaining the same concepts in different ways until the understanding arrived. I had never asked her how much she set aside from those evenings. It had not occurred to me to ask. She managed the household finances with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, and I had trusted that completely. The way you trust the structure of a house you did not build yourself, without inspecting it, because it has never given you reason to doubt it. Sitting in the workshop that afternoon, I turned the question over for the first time in a long while and found I did not know the answer. Arlo set down the sandpaper and looked up at the cage frame I had suspended between two clamps. "Grandpa," he said, "why do you sleep in the shed?" I stopped moving. He said it the way children say the things that undo you, without weight, without accusation, in the same tone he had used to ask about the wood. It was simply a thing he had noticed and wanted to understand. "Your room is upstairs," he added as though I might have forgotten. I looked at him, 5 years old, eyes that held the world as a place that was largely straightforward, where questions had answers and people who loved each other behaved accordingly. He was not asking to wound me. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to know, and that was exactly what made it so hard to hear. I did not have an answer that was true, and also something I could give to a 5-year-old. So I said something about it being easier, about having more space for my tools, and watched him accept this explanation with the trust that children extend to the adults they love. A trust so complete it has no defenses. After he went inside for dinner, I sat alone in the workshop with the unfinished cage in front of me and understood with a clarity that had been building for months without my permission what I was teaching him, not with words, with the simple daily fact of my presence in that shed, my signature on Melody's papers, my silence when Garrett spoke to me in tones no son should use with his father. I was teaching Arlo that love is what you absorb without complaint, that staying is the same as belonging, that a man can be reduced incrementally if you do it slowly enough. I thought about the promise I had made Margaret, keep this family together, no matter what. And for the first time in 6 months, I let myself sit with the question I had been walking around like a hole in the floor. Was this what she meant? Was this the family she wanted me to keep together? The one where her father slept in a storage shed and answered to her son like a man who had forgotten he used to own. The room he was standing in, I did not have an answer that night. I lay on the shed bed and looked up at the corrugated ceiling and held the question in the dark without trying to resolve it. But I had finally stopped pretending it wasn't there. 2 years, 730 days. I counted them not because I wanted to, but because each one arrived with something new to register. A new variation on an old indignity. A new measurement of how far a man can be walked back from himself without noticing until one day he looks up and does not immediately recognize the distance he has traveled. I will not give you all 730 days. Some of them were simply work and weather and the sound of Arlo's feet on the porch steps. But there are particular ones that stayed lodged in me the way a splinter does, too small to require serious attention, too persistent to ignore. There was a Tuesday in July when the temperature hit 94 degrees, and I was up on the east face of the roof, replacing 3 sections of flashing that had lifted in a spring storm. I had been up there since 8 in the morning. By noon, the roof surface was too hot to kneel on, without folding a piece of canvas underneath me, and the air had that thick coastal quality that Savannah gets in midsummer, where breathing feels like an effort. From up there, I could see Garrett on the back lawn phone to his ear moving in the slow, unhurried circle of a man having a conversation that requires some pacing. He was in the shade. He never looked up. I finished the flashing and came down. He went inside. Neither of us said anything. There was a night in October when a pipe fitting in the downstairs bathroom gave out at 2 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was awake when it happened. I sleep lighter than I used to. And the sound of water moving where it should not be is the kind of thing a man who has spent his life building things is wired to hear. I shut off the water at the main, found the fitting had it replaced inside of 40 minutes. Garrett appeared in the doorway long enough to tell me to make sure I cleaned up after myself, then went back to bed. In the morning, there was no mention of it. There was a dinner party in February. 8 guests, a catered meal, candles on the dining table I had built in 1998. Melody introduced me to a couple near the kitchen doorway. I had come in to refill the water pitcher, and she said, without hesitation and without looking at me, "This is Silas. He helps us with the house. Not my father-in-law, not Garrett's father. He helps us with the house." The couple smiled and turned back to their conversation, and I carried the pitcher back to the kitchen and stood at the sink for a moment, looking at the window above it, the one I had framed and glazed myself in the spring of 1995. There was a week in March when I left a section of the front walk unswept because I had a head cold bad enough that bending over made the pressure behind my eyes unbearable. Garrett informed me on a Thursday that until I demonstrated I could keep up with my responsibilities, he would prefer I not come into the main house. I spent that week in the shed entirely taking meals from the small cooler I kept stocked and watching the weather change through the single south-facing window. These are the days I counted, but I also counted the others. The afternoon Arlo walked across the yard with a glass of water, held carefully in both hands, moving with the deliberate balance of a child who has been trusted with something important. He handed it to me, without saying anything, and then stood beside me while I drank it, watching the middle distance with the companionable patience of someone twice his age. The drawing he slid under the shed door one evening, crayon on notebook paper, two figures of approximately equal height, standing beside a large brown rectangle he had labeled tools. Underneath in the careful oversized letters of a child who has recently learned to write grandpa and his tools. I kept it folded in the inner pocket of my work jacket. The afternoon he fell asleep against my shoulder in the workshop, his weight shifting gradually until his head dropped and his breathing slowed and he simply stayed there, trusting without deciding to trust the way children do with the people they are certain of. These are the days I also counted. They are the reason I stayed as long as I did. Through all of it, the background noise of Garrett's phone calls continued and gradually changed in character. In the early months, they had been frequent but brief. By the following spring, they were longer, lower, and carried a specific quality I had come to recognize: the sound of a man managing something that was not staying managed. I heard city names more than once Atlanta repeated with a weight that suggested it was not a place he was looking forward to visiting. Miami once in a tone I associated with money. I heard numbers spoken in the shorthand of someone who does not want to be understood by anyone nearby. Melody, meanwhile, had begun spending more time in the locked study. The door had always been lockable. I had installed that hardware myself, a good solid mortise lock in 2004, but it had rarely been used that way. Now it was closed most evenings. I would sometimes pass the hallway and hear the faint sound of her working at the computer inside, and the silence that fell whenever footsteps approached the door. Then came a night in late April 2024. I was in the workshop after supper, finishing a small repair on a drawer I had pulled from the kitchen to recut a dovetail that had finally worked loose. The kitchen window above the sink was open, and sound carried well in the yard at that hour. I heard Garrett come out the back door and move to the far corner of the patio. His usual position for calls he did not want overheard inside the house. His voice, when it came, was different from any version I had heard before. Not the clipped tension of a man buying time, not the forced pleasantness of someone managing appearances. This was quieter, and it had a quality I had not associated with my son in a very long time. He said, "I don't have it anymore. It's gone. All of it." And then, after a pause that stretched long enough that I thought the call had ended, I know that. He came back inside. The kitchen light went off. The house went quiet. I sat in the workshop with the drawer in my hands and turned what I had heard over in my mind, without arriving at any clear understanding of it. I did not know what it referred to. I did not know who he had been speaking to or what it meant for whatever arrangement was sustaining that house and the life being lived in it. But I had spent 30 years working with wood, and I knew the particular sound a structure makes when something load-bearing inside it has finally given way. Something in that house was failing from the inside out, and whatever it was, it had been going for a long time before I heard the crack. The house looked the way I always imagined it could look, given the right occasion, and someone willing to spend money on it. Garrett and Melody had hired people to handle the preparations. A florist, a catering company out of Savannah's historic district. Someone whose sole job appeared to be arranging candles on every flat surface in the front rooms. By the time guests began arriving at 7 o'clock on that Saturday evening in October, The parlor and the dining room had been transformed into something that could have appeared in a magazine. Arrangements of white and deep burgundy flowers on the mantelpiece I had carved from a single piece of Georgia marble in 2001. Candlelight, picking up the grain of the heart pine floors. The staircase banister, each spindle turned by my own hands over a winter I still remembered clearly, polished to a warmth it had not shown in years. It was the most beautiful the house had looked since Margaret was alive. I wore a white catering apron Melody had left folded on the shed steps that morning, along with a handwritten note that listed my responsibilities for the evening drink service during the reception hour, passing appetizers, clearing plates between courses, keeping the kitchen staging area organized for the catering staff. She had written it in the same neat hand she used for the contribution agreement. The guests arrived in the way that Savannah's comfortable class tends to arrive at private homes, unhurried, well-dressed, carrying the low-grade confidence of people for whom evenings like this are a regular feature of life. 20 people roughly. Attorneys, a couple of physicians, the kind of neighbors who winter somewhere warmer. They moved through the rooms I had built and admired them the way visitors admire things they assume have always belonged to someone else. Garrett worked the room with the ease of a man in his natural element. He had a way of standing in a space that communicated ownership without requiring him to say anything about it. A slight expansion of the shoulders, a particular ease in the way he moved from group to group, accepting compliments on the house as though they were simply his due. A man near the fireplace, gray-haired a doctor, someone Garrett had introduced earlier as a colleague, swept his hand toward the ceiling and said, "Beautiful home." "How long have you had it?" Garrett smiled. "It's been in the family," he said. He did not look in my direction. I was standing 8 feet away with a tray of champagne flutes, and he did not look in my direction. I moved through the room. A woman in a dark dress reached for a glass, without glancing up from her conversation, the way you reach for something you expect to be there, provided by a function rather than a person. I kept moving. I had learned over the previous 2 years the particular invisibility of service work, the way you can be present in a room full of people and occupy no one's attention. It is a skill that requires you to make yourself smaller than you are. I had become good at it. From across the room, I felt Arlo watching me. He was sitting in the corner near the bookshelf, on the small chair someone had positioned there for him, with a plate of food balanced on his knees that he was not eating. He had been dressed up for the occasion in a collared shirt that looked slightly stiff on him, the way dress clothes look on boys who would rather be in something else. He was watching me with the focused attention he usually reserved for the workshop, tracking my movement through the room with the dark eyes he had inherited from a grandmother he was too young to remember clearly. I did not look at him directly. I did not want to see what was in his expression. The evening moved through its courses. I cleared plates, refilled glasses, kept the kitchen organized the way Melody's note had instructed. The catering staff worked around me with professional indifference. The guests grew louder and warmer as the evening went on, the way people do when good food and good wine have been doing their work for a couple of hours. It was during the transition between the main course and dessert that I misjudged the edge of the serving table. I was carrying a tray with 2 empty crystal glasses and reaching to set it down when my hand caught the rim wrong. The glasses went over. The sound they made hitting the hardwood floor was the specific sharp register of fine crystal, not the dull breakage of ordinary glass. And it cut through the room in the way that sudden sounds do at moments when a conversation has briefly paused. 20 people turned. Garrett was across the room, in the time it took me to process what had happened. He moved quickly and quietly, and when he reached me, his voice was low enough that it took a moment to carry to the nearest guests. "You clumsy old fool," he said. "Do you know what that crystal cost?" Then he raised his voice. Not shouting. Garrett did not shout in company, but raised with the deliberate carrying quality of someone who intends to be heard. "Get on your knees and pick it up," he said. Every single piece. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has happened that no one is sure how to respond to. I heard the silence settle across 20 people. I felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. I looked at the floor, at the broken crystal scattered across the heart pine. I had laid myself in the spring of 1996, board by board, cut and fitted and nailed and finished, over 3 weeks of work I had been proud of. I went down on one knee, then both. My hands, which had built everything in that room, began picking up the pieces. Behind me, I heard the low sound of guests resuming conversation, the polite collective decision to look away from something uncomfortable. Somewhere in the corner by the bookshelf, I heard nothing at all, and that silence was worse than any sound. It was not the first time I had been on my knees in a room I had built. But as I turned each piece of broken crystal in my rough fingers and set it carefully on the tray, I understood, with a clarity I had not felt in 2 years, that it would be the last. The guests were gone by 9:30. I heard the last cars pull out of the driveway from inside the workshop, where I had gone as soon as Melody dismissed me from kitchen duties. I had taken off the white apron and folded it on the counter the way she would want it folded, and I had walked across the dark yard to the one place in that property that still felt like mine. The bird cage was on the workbench where I had left it held between 2 padded clamps to keep the final glue joints under pressure while they cured. I had been working on it for 3 weeks. Cherry wood, close-grained and fine, the same stock I had been saving for the right project since before Arlo was born. The dome roof was complete. 12 curved ribs meeting at a central ring. I had turned on the lathe, fitted so precisely that the seam between each piece was barely visible. The vertical bars were done individually shaped and sanded through 4 grits until the surface held light the way good cherry does, warm and deep and slightly red in the right angle of illumination. In the lower right corner of the base, I had used a small V chisel to cut a name into the wood. 4 letters. I had taken my time with them. Arlo. Tomorrow was his birthday. He was going to be 6. I was checking the tension on the last clamp when I heard the back door. Small feet on the porch steps. Familiar weight, familiar rhythm. The workshop door opened, and he was there in his pajamas, the blue ones with the small, repeated pattern of rockets that he had picked out himself at the beginning of summer. His hair was sticking up on one side. He had not been asleep. He stopped when he saw the cage. For a moment, he just looked at it standing in the doorway with a cool October air coming in around him. Then he crossed the workshop in about 4 steps and stood in front of the workbench with his hands at his sides the way he stood when he was trying very hard to be careful with something. "Grandpa," he said, "you made this for me." I told him I had. I told him the wood was cherry, same as I had used for a few things in the house, and that I had put his name on the base so it would always be his. He lifted it with both hands slowly the way I had shown him, to handle finished work, supporting, from underneath no pressure on the joints. He held it against his chest and looked at me over the top of it. I do not know exactly how to describe what his face looked like in that moment, without sounding like a man reaching for words he does not quite have. It was the expression of a child who has received something made specifically and entirely for him, and who understands without being told that the making of it took time that was chosen freely. I heard the back door of the house open again. Garrett came across the yard, with his jacket still on from the party, moving with the unhurried ease of a man who has had a successful evening and is winding down from it. He stopped a few feet from the workshop entrance. He looked at Arlo. He looked at the cage. He stepped inside and held out his hand, and after a moment, Arlo passed it to him. Garrett turned it over once, looked at the joinery on the dome, looked at the bars. His expression gave nothing away that I could read with certainty. Then he set it down on the concrete floor of the workshop, slowly, deliberately, without any particular display of emotion, and he put his foot through it. The sound it made was not loud. Cherry is a dense wood, and it does not shatter the way softer material does. It broke in the specific way that quality work breaks when it is forced past its design tolerance, which is to say it broke at the joints, the seams I had fitted and glued over 3 weeks of careful attention. The dome came apart. 2 of the bars snapped. The base with the name cut into it split cleanly down the center. Arlo's sound was immediate and total, the kind of crying that comes before a child has time to decide how they feel. The raw response of someone who does not yet have the defenses that teach you to delay it. Garrett looked at me. His voice when it came was the same pleasant neutral register he used when he was explaining something he considered self-evident. Anything without a price tag, he said, has no right to exist in this house. He turned and walked back to the house. The door closed behind him. I stood where I was. I looked at the pieces on the floor, the dome ribs scattered, the bars, the base in 2 halves, Arlo's name split down the middle, the left half, reading Arl and the right, reading O separated by the gap where the wood had given. Arlo had stopped making sound. I looked down at him. His face was wet, and he was breathing in the uneven way of someone trying to get control of something that is larger than they are. He looked at the pieces on the floor, then he looked up at me, then he went down on his knees and started picking them up. He did not say anything. He just gathered the pieces the way I had taught him to treat wood, carefully with attention, as though the material still deserved respect even in this condition. He stacked them in a small pile on the floor in front of him. I went down beside him, my knees on the cold concrete, my hands, which had made this thing over 21 days of evenings, picking up what remained of it piece by piece. We did not speak. There was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. At some point, I became aware that the kitchen door was not fully closed. There was a figure standing just inside it, still not moving. I registered it the way you register something at the edge of your attention when your focus is elsewhere. I did not look directly. I did not have the capacity in that moment to process anything beyond what was in front of me. Later, I would understand what I had seen. Later, I would know what was held in that stillness. But that night, I only knew that two things had been decided in that yard in the dark, while Arlo and I knelt together over the wreckage of something I had made with my hands. I knew what mine was. The other one I would not learn for days. The rain started around midnight. I know because I was still awake when I heard it begin. A few drops on the tin roof of the shed, then more, then the steady percussion of a real October storm coming in off the coast. Savannah gets these in the fall, sometimes the kind that arrive without much warning and run through the night and leave everything washed and heavy by morning. I had been sitting on the edge of the bed, since coming in from the workshop still in my work clothes, with the pieces of the cherry bird cage arranged on the small table beside the cooler. I had carried them in from the yard without quite deciding to. Some of the sections were still intact. 2 of the dome ribs, 3 of the vertical bars, the curved pieces I had spent the most time on. The base was in 2 halves. The half that said Arl was slightly larger than the half that said O. I looked at them for a while. Then I looked through the shed's south window at the house. The lights were off, all of them top to bottom. The party had ended. The kitchen had been cleaned by the catering staff, and the people who lived in my house had gone to sleep without sending anyone to check on the man in the backyard. I had not expected them to. I had stopped expecting things like that a long time ago, and the not expecting had become so habitual that it registered less as pain and more as weather. A condition of the environment that you account for and move around. But sitting there at 1 a.m, with the rain coming down and the birdcage pieces on the table, I let myself acknowledge it plainly for perhaps the first time. Nobody was going to come. Not tonight and not any night after this one. Not Garrett, not Melody, and Arlo was 6 years old and asleep. He had cried himself there in the corner of a room I had built over something I had made for him, that his father had destroyed, while his grandfather watched and said nothing. I looked at my hands. Carpenters develop a specific relationship with their hands over time, not vanity exactly, but a kind of professional awareness of them as tools. You learn your own grip, your own weaknesses, the places where old injuries have stiffened the range of motion. My right index finger has been crooked since 1989, when I caught it in a router at the wrong angle, and I had long since adjusted every technique I used to account for it. The calluses on my palms were so established, they had their own geography. I had hands that had framed walls and fitted joints and turned spindles and finished surfaces for 31 years. Those same hands had knelt on a parlor floor 3 hours ago and picked up crystal at my son's instruction. I stood up. I did not make a speech about it even inside my own head. I did not run through a list of grievances or arrive at a final conclusion about what it all meant. I simply stood up the way you stand up when you have been sitting in one position long enough that your body decides the sitting is finished. I got the toolbox from its place beside the workbench. It was a wooden chest I had built in 1985, early in my career, before I had the skill to do it, as well as I would later. The joinery was competent, but not elegant. The finish serviceable rather than fine. I had kept it for 40 years because it was the first real thing I had made, and because objects you have carried for 40 years become part of you, whether they deserve to or not. I carried it to the door. I took the duffel bag from under the bed. It held 2 changes of work clothes, my medication a razor. The folded drawing Arlo had slid under my door, the crayon one Grandpa and his tools, and not much else. Because I had not accumulated much in 2 years of living in a shed. I picked up the two halves of the birdcage base and put them in the bag. I don't know exactly why. They were not useful. They were not even properly salvageable. But they were the last thing I had made with full attention and genuine care, and I was not ready to leave them on a table in a building I was not planning to return to. I opened the shed door. The rain was coming steadily by then, the kind that doesn't vary much in intensity, but doesn't stop either. I carried the toolbox and the bag across the yard, to the truck, loaded them in the bed, and went back for one last look at the shed. 8 feet by 10 feet. Corrugated tin roof. One window south-facing, practical. I had built it to hold tools. It had held me instead for 2 years and 20-some days. I closed the door. The truck took 3 tries to start. It always did in cold, wet weather. The ignition had a particular reluctance that I had come to treat as a personality trait, rather than a mechanical problem. I sat in the cab with the rain on the windshield and let it run through its hesitation. On the third turn, it caught and the engine settled into the idle it had held for 30-some years of dependable if unspectacular service. I did not look back as I pulled out. The streets of Savannah at 1 in the morning in the rain are close to empty, and I drove them without seeing much, navigating by the familiarity of routes I had traveled for decades. The workshop I was heading to was a building I had worked out of for most of the 90s before I went independent. The owner had closed the operation in 2008, and the building had changed hands twice since then, without finding a permanent purpose. I knew it still had power to the main panel, because I had helped the current owner sort out an electrical issue 2 summers ago. The roof had been reshingled in 2019. It was dry inside and out of the way, and it was the only place I could think of that I had any honest claim to, however informal. I parked and carried the toolbox inside, set it on the long workbench against the south wall, the same bench where I had once spent entire winters on finish work, where I knew every irregularity in the surface from years of contact with it. I opened the box to find the flashlight I kept in the tray, and that was when I saw it. The lower compartment of the toolbox had a false bottom, which I had built into the original design in 1985 and mostly forgotten about over the years. It was not hidden in any sophisticated sense, just a panel fitted flush with the interior floor of the box, with a small finger notch at one end. I had not opened it in longer than I could accurately remember. On top of it was an envelope, old paper the cream color that white envelopes go when they have been in a dark place for years. My name on the front in a handwriting I would have recognized in any context, under any circumstances, at any hour of any night. Margaret's hand, leaning slightly right as it always had. Below my name in smaller letters, only open it when you truly need to. Silas. I put my hand flat on the envelope and held it there. The rain came down on the workshop roof, steady and unhurried the way rain does when it has all night and nowhere else to be. I had needed a great many things over the course of my 62 years. I had needed tools and lumber and time and patience, and on more than one occasion, better judgment than I was able to provide myself. But sitting in that dark workshop, with my hand on my dead wife's handwriting, and the rain on the roof, and everything I owned in a duffel bag on the floor beside me, I understood that I had never needed anything the way I needed whatever was in that envelope. I did not open it yet. I was not sure I was ready. And Margaret, who had known me better than anyone, living or dead, had not said open it immediately. She had said open it when you truly need to. I wanted to be sure I was doing it right. I sat with the envelope in my hands for a long time before I opened it. 2 hours approximately, though I was not tracking time with any precision. The rain had settled into the steady pattern it takes on when a storm has found its rhythm and intends to keep it. I had found a wooden stool and pulled it to the workbench, and I sat there in the narrow beam of the flashlight with the envelope on the bench in front of me and did not rush anything. The paper had aged the way good paper ages when it is kept dry and undisturbed, not brittle, not discolored, past the warm ivory that white paper becomes over years in the dark. The red wax seal was intact, a simple circle pressed with what appeared to be a thumb rather than a stamp. Margaret had never owned a signet ring. She had sealed it the way she did most things, practically without ceremony, but with enough care to make it hold, her handwriting on the front. I have tried to explain to people who never knew her what Margaret's handwriting looked like, and I have never quite managed it. It was not particularly beautiful in the formal sense. She had not been taught calligraphy or anything like it. It was simply hers, with a slight rightward lean that had been consistent from the first letter she ever wrote me in 1981 to the last grocery list she left on the kitchen counter the week before she went into the hospital. Unmistakable, irreducible to any other hand. For Silas. Only when you truly need it. I broke the wax seal and opened the envelope. Inside were two things. A letter, several pages folded together, written front and back in the same hand as the envelope. And beneath the letter, a sealed document from an insurance company, a policy summary, with her name as the insured and my name, Silas James Vance, as sole primary beneficiary. I read the letter first. She had written it in the fall of 2021, she said. 6 months before the diagnosis became official, though she had known something was wrong for longer than that. She had been composing it in her head for years. Before she wrote it down, she said waiting until she was sure of what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it. She told me about the insurance policy. 25 years of monthly payments drawn from the money she made, tutoring the neighborhood children on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. She had opened the policy in 1997, when Garrett was 11 years old. And she had already begun to see, she wrote, certain qualities in our son that worried her in ways she could not yet name precisely. She had not told me because she knew with the accuracy of a woman who had been married to me for 16 years at that point that I would insist the money go to the family, to the house, to whatever needed doing. She wrote, "You have never in your life spent money on yourself that could have been spent on someone else, and I loved you for it, and it drove me half crazy. And this time, I decided not to give you the choice." She had kept the policy documents at her mother's house initially, then moved them to the toolbox after her mother passed because she knew, she wrote, that you will carry that box until you can't lift it anymore, and you will carry it before you carry anything else. I keep my most important things in places where the people I trust most will not leave without them. The policy had continued to accumulate value. The current payout listed on the document beneath the letter was $174,000. I set the document down carefully on the workbench. $174,000. Enough to lease a small workshop space for several years. Enough to buy equipment. Enough to pay a year's rent on modest housing without touching a month's pension. Enough, in other words, to start over from a position of something other than desperation. Margaret had known what she was doing. She had always known what she was doing. I kept reading. She wrote about Garrett, carefully without anger, in the measured way she addressed things she had thought about for a long time. She said she hoped she was wrong about him. She said she had prayed to be wrong. But she had wanted Silas to have something that was entirely his. Something Garrett could not touch or leverage or slowly take apart. Something that existed outside the architecture of the family in a way that meant it would still be there if the architecture failed. She did not say the architecture would fail. She said if, but she had prepared for it. Near the end of the letter, she wrote about the toolbox. She wrote that she had chosen it because it was the first thing he had ever made, and because objects that have been carried for decades are more reliable than any safe or file cabinet, because people do not forget the things they carry. She wrote that she hoped he would not need the envelope for a long time. She wrote that she hoped she was wrong to prepare it at all. Then the last paragraph. "This time live for yourself, Silas. You have given enough, more than enough, more than anyone had the right to ask of you, more than I could ever fully account for. Take this and go somewhere that is yours. Build something that belongs to you. Wake up in the morning in a place where your name means what it should mean. I love you. I have always loved you. And wherever I am entirely unsurprised that you waited until 3 in the morning in an empty workshop in the rain to finally open this." I folded the letter along its original creases. I am not a man who cries easily or often. I had not cried at Margaret's funeral, which had troubled some people, though those who knew me well understood it as the particular stoicism of a man who was not finished yet, who was holding himself together because there was still ground to cover. I had not cried in the shed or on any of the 730 days that followed her death. I cried in that workshop alone at 3:30 in the morning, with the rain on the roof and a flashlight on a workbench and a letter from my dead wife in my hands. Not for long, not loudly, just the way a structure finally releases the tension it has been holding when the load is removed, completely and without reservation, and with a relief so profound it was almost indistinguishable from grief. When it passed, I folded the insurance documents carefully back into the envelope and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket against my chest. Then I sat in the dark and listened to the rain and waited for whatever came next. The first gray light was beginning to find the gaps in the workshop walls when I heard it. A knock at the door, 3 times solid and deliberate, with a particular cadence of someone who has been knocking on doors their entire life and has never once felt the need to do it softly. The knock came again before I could stand up. 2 sharp raps, the kind that split silence rather than interrupt it. Not the patient knock of someone hoping to be let in, the knock of someone who had already decided he was coming through. I had been sitting on the floor of the mill for, I don't know how long, Margaret's letter still open across my knee. The insurance file fanned beside me like a hand of cards I didn't yet know how to play. The lantern had burned low. Outside, the rain had eased to a drizzle, and the first pale light, the kind that doesn't so much arrive as it seeps in, was beginning to push through the high windows above the old saws. I got to my feet. My knees didn't thank me for it. "Coming?" I said, though the word came out quieter than I intended. I opened the mill door, and there he stood. My brother Sterling Vance has never knocked gently in 65 years of living, and that morning was no different. He was my younger brother by 3 years, the man my grandson had always called Uncle Sterling, the way Southern children attach titles to the people in their lives who feel permanent. He filled the doorframe the way he always had, 6'2", silver hair, combed back flat, the way our mother used to insist on, dressed in a charcoal vest over a pressed white shirt, despite the early hour and the long drive. In his left hand was a leather briefcase, the old kind with brass clasps. In his right, a paper cup of gas station coffee. He looked at me the way a doctor looks at a patient he already knows the diagnosis of, but hasn't said out loud yet. "You look terrible," he said. "You drove 4 hours to tell me that." "I drove 4 hours," Sterling said, stepping past me into the mill without waiting to be asked, "because Alara called me last night. And she sent me everything." He set the briefcase on the workbench and took off his jacket, folding it over the back of the old mill chair, the way he'd fold a suit jacket in a courthouse, precise, habitual. He looked around the space, the scarred timber floor, the rusted saws, the toolbox on the table, Margaret's papers still spread beside it. He didn't say anything about it. Sterling never comments on things he hasn't prepared a full opinion on. "Sit down, Silas." I sat on the stool near the bench. He pulled out his phone first. She sent 2 videos. The first one I recognized. The anniversary party, the candles, the good crystal, the guests with their backs to me. You could see me in the frame without knowing you were looking for me. The old man in the white apron carrying the tray along the far edge of the room, trying to take up as little space as possible. Then the tray going down wrong, the sound of the crystal sharp and clean in the quiet room. Garrett crossing the floor, voice low first, then rising. Get on your knees and pick it up, every single piece. I watched myself go down to the floor, watched my hands, the same hands that laid the foundation of that house and fitted every oak stair tread, working across the parquet collecting broken glass while 20 people found somewhere else to look. "I've seen it," I said. "I know, but watch it again. Watch it like it's happening to someone you love." I didn't want to, but I did. It hit differently from the outside. That's the only way I can put it. When you are the one kneeling, you are too busy managing the next moment, where to put your hands, how to breathe evenly, how not to let your face show anything to understand what it looks like from 6 feet away. What it looks like is a man being unmade in his own home. The second video was shorter. Nighttime, the garden workshop, a lantern burning in the corner, my lantern. Arlo in pajamas holding the bird cage I'd finished that morning. 3 weeks of work in red heartwood, the dome jointed without a single nail, his name carved along the base. Then Garrett's hands, the crack, the wood under his shoe. Anything without a price tag has no right to exist in this house. And Arlo afterward kneeling beside me to pick up the pieces. Sterling turned his phone face down on the bench. He was quiet for a moment. "She filmed that herself," he said, "standing behind the kitchen door. She's been collecting for 6 months. He paused. "She called me the night the bird cage happened. I told her we needed more. She's been getting more." He opened the briefcase then. I had expected legal pads, maybe a court summons, something that matched the hour and the drive. What he set down was a folder thick with tab documents, and beneath it, a secondary file held with a rubber band. "There are things you need to know, Silas. About Garrett, about the money, about Margaret." I looked at him. "About Margaret." Sterling pulled the secondary file loose, but didn't open it yet. He pressed one finger against the top tab of the main folder, instead, a habit from 30 years of standing before judges. "Before we get to that, sit with me on something." He slid the main folder toward me and opened it to a page near the middle, a legal document, the kind with small, dense type and signature blocks at the bottom. He pointed to a clause near the top of the second page. "Silas," he said, "do you know what a living trust is?" I looked at the page. Dense language, the kind that takes a lawyer to hold. My name appeared in the clause he was pointing to. Not a forgery, not a fraud, but my own signature from a document I had no memory of signing in that form. I looked up at him. "Margaret set it up in 2003, Sterling said quietly. "She asked me to hold the documentation. She said—" He stopped, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Sterling Vance looked like he was choosing his words with something other than professional detachment. "She said she didn't want you to know until you needed to." I looked back down at the paper, at my name, at the clause Sterling's finger rested on, and I began to understand why my brother had driven 4 hours from Atlanta at 6 o'clock in the morning instead of picking up the phone. Before I tell you what Sterling laid on that bench, what he had been holding back for years, what changes everything you thought you understood about this story, drop a 12 in the comments. Let me know you are still here. One thing worth saying, the stories I share contain fictional elements woven in for depth and clarity. Some details may not reflect any single lived experience, and if you would rather step away here, that is completely your choice. But what comes next, you will want to hear it. The light had shifted by then. When Sterling first knocked, the mill windows held nothing but gray, the flat, uncommitted gray of a southern morning that hasn't decided yet whether it wants to be beautiful or bleak. By the time he set the second folder on the bench between us, the light had turned ivory, the kind that catches dust suspended in still air and pulls age out of old wood grain. It caught the brass clasps of his briefcase. It caught the lines around his mouth that hadn't been there 10 years ago, and the deliberate stillness in his posture that I recognized from courthouse corridors, the posture of a man preparing to deliver something irrevocable. Sterling did not open the folder immediately. He set it down the way you set down something heavy enough that you want the other person to feel the weight before they see what's inside. Then he folded his hands over it, looked at me across the workbench, and I noticed for the first time in 65 years of knowing this man that he'd look tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. "There are things about Margaret I need to tell you," he said. "Things I kept from you because she asked me to." I had watched Sterling cross-examine witnesses argue before appellate judges deliver verdicts of fact in rooms full of people trained to show nothing. His voice had never once changed register before saying something terrible. It was steady now. That steadiness told me everything. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Since 2018. He opened the folder. Inside were documents I did not recognize. Not the legal filings I had expected, but medical records, insurance policy statements, and a single cashier's receipt dated March 14th, 2018. The amount printed on it was $79,400. Sterling turned the receipt toward me and let me look at it without speaking. A lawyer's habit let the evidence introduce itself. "Garrett was 23 when it started," he said after a moment. "The gambling, sports betting, first then card tables in Atlanta, then the wrong men, entirely the kind who don't send notices in the mail. By the fall of 2017, he owed $80,000, and the people he owed it to were not patient. I kept looking at the receipt. Margaret found out before you did. Garrett came to her, not to you, to her. He understood which one of you would protect him without requiring him to change, and which one would hold him accountable. He chose correctly the way a man chooses the weaker door when he needs to get through." Sterling's voice remained level. Mine stayed shut. She had a whole life policy she'd been paying into since 1991. 27 years of premiums. The surrender value at that point was enough to cover the debt with a margin left over. He tapped the receipt once lightly. She surrendered it the full cash value, every dollar of it, to pay the men Garrett owed. She had 2 policies, Silas. That older one, the 27-year policy, was the one she gave up. The second policy, the one she opened in 1997, she protected. She never told Garrett it existed. That is the one she left for you. And she called me the day she did it and made me promise, made me give her my word. As her brother-in-law and as the attorney, she trusted that I would not tell you, not while she lived. The mill was quiet. The drizzle had started again on the tin roof, a soft, uneven sound, the kind that fills a room without filling it. The policy had a rider, I said. I heard my own voice come out flat, and even like a man reading from a document rather than speaking. Long-term care, medical coverage. Yes, she surrendered all of it. Yes, in the last 2 years of Margaret's life, she had gone to a doctor who operated out of a sliding scale clinic on Whitmore Street. She had told me it was where she preferred to go, said she liked the staff, said the parking was easy, said the large hospital made her feel processed rather than cared for. I had believed her. I had believed her completely without hesitation, because in 41 years of marriage, Margaret had never once given me reason to question what she said without hesitation. I had driven her to Whitmore Street 17 times. I had waited in the parking lot with the windows down and the radio on low. And I had not once thought to ask why a woman with a cancer diagnosis was not being treated at a comprehensive oncology center. She had been diagnosed in the spring of 2020. The oncologist, the one she saw at the initial referral before she redirected her care to Whitmore Street, had told us both that it was caught at a manageable stage, that the standard immunotherapy protocol had strong outcomes at this stage of presentation. He had said the words very treatable, and Margaret had held my hand and nodded, and I had exhaled for the first time in 3 weeks. How much would the full treatment have cost? I asked Sterling. He considered the question carefully. The immunotherapy protocol alone ran approximately $12,000 a month. With active coverage out-of-pocket exposure, would have been minimal, a few $100s per cycle at most. A pause. Without coverage, the full cost fell to the patient. And she chose a clinic that could work within what she had. She stretched what she had as far as it would reach, Sterling said, without ever letting you see the edge of it. I looked at my hands on the bench. The yellow pine I had sanded and finished in 1989, 3 coats of Danish oil, a surface I had pressed my palms against 10,000 times while thinking about wood and joinery and grain. I pressed them against it now and felt nothing except the particular smoothness of old wood, worn further by years of use. Margaret had sat in that clinic's waiting room with a styrofoam cup of bad coffee and a crossword book, and she had smiled at me afterward every single time and said, "The doctor says I'm doing well." And I had kissed her temple in the parking lot and thought, good, we will be fine. Garrett had stood at her funeral 2 years later in a dark suit and wept openly. People had remarked on it afterward. He was so devoted to her. You could see how much it broke him. He had stood in my kitchen and accepted a plate of food people brought, and he had known for 2 years by that point what his debt had cost her. And he had looked at me across that kitchen and said nothing. 8 years. Sterling let me sit with it. He picked up the gas station coffee cup stone, cold by now, and set it back down without drinking. A small motion. The kind hands make when the rest of you doesn't know what to do with itself. After a while, he reached back into the briefcase and placed a second folder on the bench beside the first. Thinner. Squared precisely at the edges, the way Sterling squared everything. I looked at my hands again. A faint tremor in the left, the kind you can suppress by pressing down. I pressed down. It was not age. "There's more," Sterling said. He did not frame it as a question, and he did not soften it. "I know," I said. I had thought the truth about Margaret was the worst thing I would hear that morning. I was wrong. Sterling opened the second folder. He did it the same way he had opened the first, without ceremony, without announcing what was inside. Just the soft sound of a manila cover folding back against the workbench, and then the clean white edge of a bank document facing up toward the mill light. He turned it toward me and waited. The document was a withdrawal authorization form. Standard bank letterhead, the kind I had signed dozens of times over 40 years of managing a retirement account. There were 2 signature lines at the bottom of the page, one for the account holder, one for the authorized witness. My name was printed beneath the first line. and above the printed name in ink was a signature. I have signed my name approximately the same way since I was 19 years old. A carpenter learns early that consistency matters in measurement and cut in the mark you leave on a document. My capital S breaks left before it curves. My L never fully closes at the top. The signature on that document had neither of those things. I never signed this, I said. No, Sterling said. You didn't. He laid out 3 more pages beside the first. Different dates, same form, same forged signature in the same careful hand, close enough to fool a bank teller processing 40 transactions a day. Not close enough to fool someone who had been looking for it. The first transfer went through 14 months ago, Sterling said. September of last year, the last one cleared 8 weeks ago. 8 separate transactions over 8 months, each one just under the threshold that triggers an automatic fraud review. I looked at the dates, the amounts beside each one. I did not add them up out loud because I did not need to. Sterling had already placed a summary sheet at the bottom of the stack, $340,000. The full balance of a retirement account I had been contributing to since 1987. 37 years of deferred wages of choosing the smaller truck and the longer work week and the vacations we did not take, converted into a number on a wire transfer record addressed to accounts I had never seen before. Where did it go? I asked. Sterling had a second sheet ready. He set it down beside the summary with the practiced efficiency of a man who has delivered this kind of information before and knows that the only merciful approach is to deliver it completely. I read it slowly the way you read something you want to be wrong about. The first $140,000 had gone to 3 separate accounts, 2 of them linked to an LLC registered in Florida that had been dissolved 8 months prior, a company that had existed on paper long enough to receive money and long enough to close. The third account belonged to a sports book operating out of a server in Curacao, accessible in the United States through a VPN and a wire transfer, and the kind of optimism that does not learn from experience. The next $90,000 had gone to credit card balances. 4 cards, 3 different banks, all carrying balances that suggested years of spending at a rate that bore no relationship to any legitimate income Garrett had ever reported. The remaining $110,000 had been distributed across 6 transfers over the last 4 months. Sterling pointed to the final entry on the sheet without speaking. I read the account name twice. Melody Vance, personal account, $50,000. She knew, I said. She knew, Sterling confirmed. The transfers to her account began 11 months ago. The timing suggests she was informed of the plan and began securing her share before the account was fully drained. I set the paper down. There is a particular quality to anger that arrives late after grief, after silence, after the long months of pressing your hands flat on a surface to keep them from showing what they feel. It does not arrive loud. It arrives the way a structural failure arrives in old wood, not with a crack, but with a slow, deep settling. The sound of something that has been holding weight far past its tolerance, finally acknowledging what it has been asked to carry. I had been paying $2,800 a month for the last 2 years, $340 left over after each payment. I had rationed medication. I had driven with the low fuel light on because gasoline was $60 I needed for something else. I had eaten what I could manage on what remained, and I had told myself it was temporary, that things would stabilize, that the arrangement would become more reasonable once the household found its footing. The household had not been finding its footing. The household had been sinking. The mortgage, I said. Sterling nodded. 80% loan to value. They refinanced in 2021, pulled out equity to cover earlier debts. The monthly payment is $300. Without your $2,800 contribution, they would have missed the last payment in September. He paused. Your contribution is not a care fee, Silas. It is the difference between that house going into foreclosure and not. I looked at the mill wall. The old saws hanging there, the ones I had not used in years, but had not been able to leave behind a crosscut. A rip saw. A small Japanese pull saw Margaret had bought me one Christmas because she had read somewhere that Japanese craftsmen preferred them. I had never told her I already had one. I had used hers instead. The anger was not loud. but it was present now, in a way it had not been before, sitting in the room with us the way a third person sits, taking up space, changing the air. Ilara found all of this, I said. It was not a question. Ilara found all of this, Sterling said. She started pulling threads 14 months ago. Bank records, transfer confirmations, the LLC filings in Florida, the credit accounts. She also pulled your medical records from 2022. There was no cardiac flag, Silas. The blood work Garrett described to you, it did not exist. We checked with your physician directly. She built the case methodically the way you would build something you needed to last. He looked at me steadily. She is 28 years old, and she did this alone because she did not want to bring it to me until it was complete. She said she had one chance to do it right, and she was not going to waste it. I thought about the kitchen doorway, the figure I had not been able to identify the night the bird cage broke. The way Ilara had pressed my hand in the kitchen 2 years ago and said not yet, with the certainty of someone who already knew the shape of the plan. 28 years old, 14 months, alone. Sterling closed the folder. Then he looked at me across the workbench with the expression I had last seen on his face in a courtroom in 2009, just before he turned back to the bench and asked the question that ended the case. Silas, he said, do you want to know what's happening inside that house right now? I looked at him. Yes, I said. Sterling reached into the briefcase one final time. What he produced was not a folder. It was a bound document, dark blue, cover white label, the kind that gets filed with a county clerk and then sits undisturbed in a drawer for decades, waiting for the moment it becomes necessary. He set it on the workbench between us and turned it so the label faced me. Vance Family Living Trust. Established 1994. Trustee Sterling R. Vance. I had signed this document 30 years ago at a table in Sterling's office on Peachtree Street. A Wednesday in October. The same October. I broke ground on the house foundation. The year Garrett was 3 years old, and Margaret was pregnant with Ilara. And the future looked like something you could build with your hands if you worked carefully and planned far enough ahead. Sterling had slid it across his desk and said, "Put the land in a living trust, Silas. Just the land. Call it precautionary." I had asked what he meant by precautionary. And he had looked at me with the expression of a man who had spent his career watching families dissolve over real estate and said, "It means 30 years. From now, you'll either never need it or you'll be very glad it's there." I had signed it without reading every clause. I had trusted him. He was my brother. "Walk me through it," I said. Sterling opened the cover and turned to a tabbed page near the middle. His finger rested on a paragraph I had not thought about since the afternoon I initialed it. When you purchased this property in 1993, he said, you titled the land, the parcel, the ground itself, in the name of this trust. Not in your name personally, not in Margaret's name, in the trust and the house. The house is a structure, legally separate from the land beneath it. When you signed the deed over to Garrett in 2022, you transferred ownership of the structure. He paused. You cannot transfer what you do not own. You never owned the land outright. The trust did. I looked at the paragraph, dense language built to withstand argument. But the meaning once Sterling had pointed me toward it was not complicated at all. Garrett owned a house. He did not own the ground it was built on. He doesn't know, I said. The deed transfer in 2022 was processed through a title company that did not catch the distinction, a common oversight when the trust document isn't cross-referenced during closing. The 1994 trust had been recorded in a supplemental instrument index at the county clerk's office, a separate ledger from the standard deed chain that a standard title search would not automatically pull unless the examiner searched under the trustee's name rather than the property address. Garrett's closing attorney had not done so. Garrett's attorney, if he had one, reviewing the paperwork, missed it entirely. Sterling's voice carried no satisfaction, just the flat precision of coordinates being read aloud. Garrett has been living in a house sitting on land he has no legal claim to. He has been leveraging a mortgage against an asset he does not fully own. The bank holding that mortgage does not know this yet. The workbench was solid under my hands. I focused on that for a moment. Yellow pine, 35 years of use, worn into the grain. The particular sensation of something that holds when other things don't. What does it mean practically? I asked. It means that as trustee, I have the authority, and under the terms of this document, the obligation to act in the interest of the trust beneficiary, which is you. He turned to another tab page near the back. There is a reversionary clause. If the primary beneficiary voluntarily vacates the property for a continuous period exceeding 72 hours, the trustee may exercise the right of reclamation. The land reverts to active trust management. Any structure on that land becomes, legally speaking, an unauthorized improvement on trust property. That's the thing. I worked through the sentence carefully, the way I once worked through a structural drawing that didn't add up. Garrett's house, I said, would become an illegal structure. It would become a structure on land he has no right to occupy without a ground lease which does not exist, or the explicit consent of the trustee. Sterling looked at me steadily. Which I am not inclined to provide. Garrett could argue constructive contribution that years of mortgage payments and maintenance work established an equitable interest in the land. Sterling had already considered this. The trust instrument contained explicit anti-merger language drafted in 1994 specifically to prevent that argument. It would not hold. The light through the mill windows had shifted to full gold. By then, the clean morning light that makes sawdust look amber and old timber looked like it still has something left to give. I had not slept. My back was telling me this in the direct, unambiguous language back's use after 65 years of work. I did not feel tired. The 72 hours, I said. When did the clock start? Sterling glanced at his watch. You left the property at approximately 1 in the morning. It is now just past 6. He settled back on his stool. You have been gone 5 hours. We have 67 remaining. And you don't intend to wait 67 hours. I intend to use them, he said. There is a difference between waiting and working. He closed the trust document and squared it against the bench edge with the same precision he applied to everything. The habit of a man who believed that how you handle a document reflects how, and seriously, you take what it contains. What happens in the next 3 days will determine what Garrett loses and what you recover. The trust is the foundation. Everything else we build from there. I thought about the word foundation. 30 years ago, I had poured the concrete for this house's foundation myself, mixed the first batch by hand before the truck arrived, because I wanted to understand the material I was building on. I had not thought about that morning in a long time. The house had stood on that foundation for 30 years. The foundation, it turned out, had never been Garrett's to claim. Sterling's phone rang before either of us could speak again. He looked at the screen. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise, but the particular absence of surprise that arrives when a thing you have been quietly expecting finally shows up on schedule. He answered, listened without speaking, said 3 words I could not make out from where I sat. Then he ended the call and set the phone face down on the bench in one deliberate motion. He looked across the workbench at me. In 65 years, I had seen Sterling Vance angry, exhausted, triumphant, and professionally blank. What I saw now was none of those things exactly. It was the expression he wore in a courtroom when the last piece of evidence fell into place, not the moment of victory, but the moment just before it, when he could see exactly how the rest of the argument would go. That was melody, he said. Sterling let the silence after those 3 words sit for a moment, the way he let evidence sit long enough for the weight of it to settle before he added anything on top. Then he picked up his phone, turned it face up, and set it back down without looking at it. She called to ask if I knew where you were, he said. She told me she was worried, that you hadn't come home last night and Garrett was concerned. He paused. She used the word home. I said nothing. She then asked me very carefully, the way someone asks a question they have rehearsed, whether I would be willing to have a document notarized. A supplemental ownership confirmation. Something that establishes on the record that Garrett Vance is the sole and uncontested legal owner of the property at this address. Sterling's voice remained even. She said it was for estate planning purposes. She said she hoped I wouldn't mind, given that I was already familiar with the family's legal history. I looked at him. Estate planning. That is what she said. I had met Melody 12 years ago at the rehearsal dinner, the night before her wedding to Garrett. She had shaken my hand with both of hers and told me she had heard so much about me and that the house was absolutely stunning. I had thanked her, and thought this is a woman who knows the price of things. I had not understood at the time that this was not a compliment I was forming, as she's preparing to divorce him, I said. She has been preparing for approximately 8 months, Sterling said. Her attorney filed a divorce petition with the Chatham County Superior Court 11 days ago. Under Georgia's equitable distribution statute, marital assets are divided based on contribution and need. The house, as the primary marital asset, would be the centerpiece of any settlement. He folded his hands on the bench. She wants the house, Silas, not a share of it, the house. She calculated that with Garrett's financial exposure, the fraud, the debt, the LLC collapse, he would have no viable legal standing to contest it. She would walk away with the structure free and clear, and she needed my signature to confirm Garrett owned it outright. She needed a notarized statement from a family member with legal knowledge confirming uncontested ownership, something she could present to a judge to preempt any title complications. Sterling's expression did not change. She chose to call me. The irony of it arrived slowly, the way irony does when it is also true. Melody had spent 8 months constructing a plan. She had watched Garrett's finances collapse and quietly moved $50, 000, into her own account, and engaged a divorce attorney and filed a notice of intent and calculated every angle with the same careful attention. To detail she applied to color-coded spreadsheets and household expense reports. She had been by any measure methodical. And then she had called the one man whose legal role made her plan impossible, and she had told him exactly what she needed, and she had done it voluntarily without coercion at 6 a.m. from her own phone. She doesn't know about the trust, I said. She does not. She has never seen the original property documentation. She knows Garrett holds a deed to the house. She does not know the land beneath it is a separate legal instrument held by a trustee whose fiduciary obligation runs entirely to you. Sterling paused. When she called me to request a confirmation of Garrett's ownership, she was, without knowing it, notifying the trustee of an active legal dispute over trust property. Which means what? Which means my fiduciary duty requires me to act immediately to protect the trust asset. I do not need to wait for the 72-hour window. He said it without emphasis, the way you state a mathematical fact. Her call constituted formal notice of a third-party claim against property held in trust. Under the terms of the trust document and Georgia trust law, that notice obligates the trustee to intervene without delay. I sat with that. Melody had called Sterling to get what she wanted. In doing so, she had handed him the legal mechanism to take away everything she had been planning to claim. She had picked up the phone and dialed the one number that collapsed her own strategy, and she had done it because she did not know, could not have known. Without seeing a document filed in a county courthouse 30 years ago, that the man she was calling was not a family member she could enlist. He was the trustee. He was the wall she had been running toward without seeing. What happens to her? I asked. Her divorce proceeds, Sterling said. But there is no house to award. A structure built on trust property without a ground lease has no independent market value she can claim in a settlement. Her attorney will advise her shortly that the primary asset in her case no longer exists in the form she understood it to. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it aside. She will receive her share of whatever liquid assets remain in the marital estate. Given what we know about those assets, that number will not be large. I thought about the spreadsheets. The color-coded columns, the $50,000, move quietly into a separate account, the 11 months of careful preparation. I did not feel satisfaction. What I felt was something closer to exhaustion, not the physical kind, but the kind that comes from finally understanding how long something has been happening around you while you were looking the other way. She thought she was the smartest person in that house, I said. Sterling considered this for a moment with the seriousness he applied to most statements. She was the smartest person in that house, he said. She simply did not know whose house it was. He stood up then. He lifted his jacket from the back of the mill chair and put it on with the same methodical precision he brought to everything left, arm, right arm, 2 buttons, collar settled flat. He reached into the briefcase and produced a single business card, which he set on the workbench beside the trust document. "We have one stop to make first," he said. "The county recorder's office opens at 8. I want the reclamation filing on record before business hours are done today. He picked up the briefcase. Then I'm taking you home. I looked at the mill around me, the old saws on the wall, the workbench I had built in 1989, the toolbox Margaret had kept for 25 years in a compartment I had never thought to open. The lantern burned down to almost nothing, now its light swallowed by the morning, coming through the high windows. Home. Sterling said it the way he said most things plainly without decoration, as a statement of fact. But I had not heard that word directed at me in 2 years. Not in a way that meant something I was allowed to return to. Not in a way that carried the weight of belonging, rather than obligation. I stood up. I reached for my jacket on the nail by the door, the same nail I had hung it on when I came in the night before, because old habits are the last things to leave you even when everything else does. I put it on. "Let's go," I said. I was not there when Sterling knocked on the door of that house. I was sitting in a leather chair in his Peachtree Street office, the same office where I had signed the trust document 30 years ago. The same mahogany desk. The same window overlooking the street where Atlanta moved through its Tuesday afternoon, as if nothing particular were happening anywhere. Sterling had left me there with a cup of real coffee and the particular silence of a room that has absorbed too many people waiting for news that will rearrange their lives. My phone rang at 2:47. Ilara. I answered before the second ring finished. "Dad." Her voice was steady, not the steadiness of someone holding something back, but the steadiness of someone who has been carrying a weight long enough that setting it down arrives not with collapse, but with quiet. "It's done. Let me tell you everything." She told me Sterling arrived at 2 o'clock precisely. He had 2 officers from the Chatham County Sheriff's Office with him, civil standby he had arranged with the possibility of criminal execution pending depending on how the afternoon went. They walked up the front path of a house I had built with my own hands, and Sterling knocked the way he knocked everything twice hard without apology. The Chatham County District Attorney's Office had reviewed Ilara's evidence file the previous Thursday. The warrants had been signed that morning before Sterling knocked. Garrett answered the door himself. Ilara said he looked at Sterling the way people look at someone unexpected but unthreatening, the mild, slightly impatient expression of a man who has always assumed that whatever room he stands in is fundamentally his. He asked Sterling what he was doing there. Sterling said he had documentation to present. Garrett stepped back from the door with the elaborate ease of a man demonstrating he had nothing to hide, which is a different posture entirely from a man who actually has nothing to hide. Sterling set the trust document on the dining room table, the same table where I had carried trays of food for 20 guests, the same room where I had gone to my knees on the parquet floor to collect broken crystal in silence. Sterling opened the document to the tabbed page and read the relevant clause aloud in the same voice he used in courtrooms. Not loud, not theatrical, simply precise. Each word placed exactly where it needed to land. Garrett laughed. Ilara said it was a short laugh, the kind that precedes a counter-argument. He said something about old paperwork, about misunderstandings, about making a phone call and sorting this out. Sterling let him finish. Then he set a second document beside the first the county recorder's filing, from that morning time stamped at 8:17 a.m., confirming the trust reclamation was officially on record. The laugh did not come a second time. Melody came down the stairs while Sterling was still speaking. Ilara had been watching from the kitchen doorway, the same angle, different evidence in her hands this time. Ilara described it this way. Melody looked at the officers first, then at Sterling, then at Garrett, and something moved across her face in that sequence. The rapid recalculation of a woman who had prepared for several scenarios and was now trying to determine which one she was standing inside. Melody said she was a victim. She said it clearly and at once with the composed delivery of someone who had rehearsed the line. She had no knowledge of the financial transfers. Garrett had managed all the accounts. She had been kept in the dark about the debt, about all of it. She said this looking directly at the officers, not at Sterling, which was a choice Ilara noticed. Sterling let her finish. Then he placed a third document on the table. The divorce filing notice of intent dated 11 days prior, her attorney's name printed at the bottom. Beside it, a single bank statement for a personal account, in Melody's name alone, recording a transfer of $50,000 received 9 months ago. Ilara said Melody looked at those 2 documents for a long moment without speaking. The officers had their own paperwork ready by then. What Alara did not describe in detail, and what I did not ask her to describe, was the sound the handcuffs made. Some things you do not need to hear in order to understand. What she did tell me was that she had been watching the staircase the entire time, because she had known for 14 months, had accounted for it specifically in every version of the plan she had built, that there was one thing in that house she needed to reach before anything else. Arlo had appeared at the top of the stairs at some point during the reading of the charges. He was holding the railing with both hands, the way small children hold railings, when they sense that something in the adult world below them has shifted past the ordinary. His face carried the particular seriousness of a 7-year-old who knows that what he is seeing matters even without the words to say why. Ilara went up the stairs before the officers moved. She did not run. She walked the way she had done everything across 14 months, without rushing, without drawing attention to herself, with her attention fixed entirely on what needed protecting. She picked Arlo up and held him against her shoulder and carried him down the hall to his room, and she closed the door behind them. She stayed in there with him until the house went quiet downstairs. She was still in there when she called me. I listened to all of it without speaking. When she finished, there was a silence between us that was not uncomfortable. The silence of two people who have arrived at the same place by different routes and are taking a moment to recognize where they are. Then Alara said, "Dad, I'm sorry it took so long." Oh, I looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline, going amber in the late afternoon light, the way southern cities go in October, slowly, thoroughly, as if the day is reluctant to surrender itself, and the light is inclined to agree. I thought about 14 months. I thought about a kitchen doorway and a phone held steady in a young woman's hand and the patience required to build something that will hold rather than something that will merely stand. "You didn't take too long," I said. "You took exactly as long as it needed." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, do you want to come home?" I sat with that question. Home. Sterling had used that word this morning in the mill, and it had moved something in me I had not known was still movable. Now my daughter was saying it, and it carried a different weight, not a destination someone else was driving me toward, but a question she was asking me directly. And the asking of it was its own kind of answer. "Yes," I said. "I want to come home." Sterling pulled up to the house at 5:30. The drive from Atlanta had taken just under 4 hours, most of it in silence of the comfortable kind, the silence of two people who have known each other long enough that words are optional. Sterling had driven with one hand on the wheel and the news on low, and I had watched Georgia move past the window, the flatlands giving way to the Spanish moss and live oaks of the coastal plain. And I had thought about very little. Sometimes the mind, after enough hours of receiving, simply stops. He turned off the engine at the end of the front path and did not get out immediately. "You don't need me to come in," he said. It was not a question. "No," I said, "but thank you." He nodded once the way Sterling nodded things, a full acknowledgement compressed into a single motion. I opened the door and got out, and I heard him put the car in reverse before I had taken 3 steps up the path. Because Sterling Vance has always understood that the most generous thing you can do at the end of a long day is leave someone alone in the right place. I looked up. Ilara was standing in the open doorway. She had Arlo on her hip, one arm under him, his head resting against her shoulder with the loose, trusting weight of a child who has fallen most of the way asleep and is relying entirely on the person holding him. The porch light was on behind her. The early evening light came in low and amber from the west, the kind of light that makes everything look like it is being seen for the last time or the first. My daughter has her mother's eyes. She always has, dark and direct and capable of holding more than they let on. She was looking at me across the length of the front path and not saying anything, and in the shape of her face in that light, I saw Margaret as I had first seen her, 23 years old, standing in the doorway of a house that was not yet finished, waiting for me to come home from the lumberyard. I walked up the path. I walked through the front door of my house for the first time in 2 years. The front hall smelled the way it always had, old wood, and the particular coolness that comes from high ceilings and solid walls, the smell of a house built to last. I had forgotten that smell, or not forgotten it exactly, but stopped expecting to encounter it. It hit me somewhere in the chest, the way smells do when they carry memory inside them. Alara put Arlo down on the sofa in the front room and covered him with a throw blanket, and we went to the kitchen and she made coffee the way she made everything quietly, without asking what I wanted, because she already knew. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. 14 months, I said. 14 months and 11 days, she said. I looked at my coffee cup. You did it alone. Daniel helped where he could. Sterling guided the legal framework from the beginning. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. But the evidence, the banking records, the LLC filings, the transfer confirmations, the recorded footage, that was mine. I built it myself because I needed to be certain it would hold. She paused. I needed him to lose everything he could never get back, not just lose a lawsuit, lose the ability to do it to anyone else. I nodded slowly. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. She looked at me directly the way her mother used to look at me when she was about to say something I needed to hear, but had not asked for. Because you would have stopped me, she said. You would have told me it wasn't worth it. You would have said Garrett was still family, that Arlo needed his father present, that we shouldn't make it worse. She said it without accusation, the steady voice of someone stating a fact they have lived with long enough to say plainly. You would have protected him, the way you always protected him, because that's what you do. I sat with that. She was right. I knew she was right in the particular way. You know, things that you would rather not with resistance. But with the quiet recognition of a pattern you can finally see from the outside because someone has just handed you the view. I had protected Garrett his entire life. From consequences, from accountability, from the version of himself he became when no one was watching. I had done it because Margaret had asked me to keep the family together. And because I had confused keeping a family together with keeping a family comfortable. And because I had never once asked myself whether those were the same thing. They were not the same thing. I stood up from the table. Alara looked up at me, and I reached across and put my arms around her the way I had not done in years. Not since Margaret's funeral. Not since the last time the weight of something had made us both reach for the nearest solid thing. She was still for a moment, the way people are when they are surprised by what they needed, and then she leaned into it. We stayed like that for a while. Arlo came in from the front room at a run. He had been asleep, or appeared to have been, and now he was entirely awake the way children are when something important is happening that they don't want to miss. He skidded to a stop on the kitchen floor and looked at me with Margaret's eyes in a 7-year-old's face, and then he held up what was in his hand. It was a small cloth pouch, the kind you get at a craft store, drawstring pulled tight. He set it on the table in front of me, with the gravity of someone presenting something that matters. I kept them, Grandpa, he said. After Dad broke it, I kept all the pieces I could find. I looked at the pouch. I knew what was inside before I opened it. I loosened the drawstring anyway and turned it over, and the pieces of red heartwood came out onto the table, small, irregular, the broken remains of 3 weeks of carving. I could see the edge of the curved dome, one slat still intact, and a small section of the base where the letters had been. R. The low was missing, but the R was there. Can we fix it, Grandpa? Arlo asked. Can we put it back together? I looked at the pieces on the table. Red heartwood broken clean in some places and splintered in others. Each fragment something I had shaped by hand across 3 weeks of early mornings, in a shed with a single lamp and my grandson's face in my mind. 7 years old. He had gathered these pieces from the floor the night his father destroyed them, and he had carried them in a pouch for a year. And he had kept them, because something in him understood the way children understand things, before they have words for the understanding that some things are worth the effort of saving. Yes, I said. We can fix it. The morning came in clean. Arlo was already in the garden workshop when I got there, sitting on his low stool, the cloth pouch open on the workbench. The pieces of red heartwood arranged in a careful pattern across the surface. He had been trying to see how they fit back together. He looked up when I came through the door. I think the big pieces are still good, he said. The little ones are too small. I pulled my stool beside him and looked at what he had laid out. 3 slats intact along their grain. 1 curved section of the dome joint still clean. The smaller splinters were past reassembly, but the larger pieces have shaped towards something new, rather than forced back into what they had been held real possibility. You're right, I said. The big pieces are good. He looked satisfied the way children look satisfied when an adult confirms what they already suspected. So what are we making? I picked up one of the slats and turned it in my hands. Red heartwood. Dense, close grain, the kind that takes 40 years to reach the center of a tree. Garrett's shoe had cracked it, but not crushed it. The grain had held. Good wood does not fail from the outside in. It only fails when something at its core has already given way. Something better, I said. I showed him how to hold the small plane, right hand at the back to guide the pressure left hand at the front to keep the angle true. He was too young to do the work himself, but not too young to understand what the work was. And there is a difference between those two things that matters more than most people realize. We worked through the morning. I shaped, he watched, and he handed me pieces from his arrangement with the gravity of someone who understood that the selection mattered. Alara brought coffee at 9 and set it on the corner of the bench without staying, which was the right thing to do. By noon, we had the frame of something, not a bird cage, but a small box with a hinged lid and a lattice top. I worked the R from the original base into the front panel, as an inlay set into a strip of darker walnut from the scrap bin, not restored, remade. The same wood shaped into something it had not been before. "Grandpa," Arlo said, looking at it. "What's it for?" "Whatever you need it to be for," I said. He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. That was October. By January, I had signed a lease on the old Whitfield Street workshop, 2 rooms on the ground floor of a building that had been a furniture maker's shop in the 1940s. Douglas fir floors, 60 years of sawdust worked into every surface. The insurance policy Margaret had kept for 25 years covered the first year's lease, the equipment, and enough left over to keep the lights on while the work found me. It found me faster than I expected. Savannah has no shortage of old things that need careful hands. Antique sideboards with warped drawer faces, plantation shutters with broken slats, a set of Victorian porch columns from a house on Gaston Street that had been painted over 14 times and needed someone patient enough to find the original wood underneath. I was patient. I had been practicing patience for 2 years, in a shed with a tin roof, and patience, unlike most things, transfers. Arlo came on Saturdays. He had his own stool at the Whitfield Street workshop, now the same low one from the garden shop carried over in the truck bed. He did homework there while I worked, and sometimes he watched, and his questions were always better than I expected. I did not go back to the Gothic house. The trust reclamation moved through the county system with the efficiency of paperwork correctly prepared. And whatever happened to the structure on that land afterward was a matter I left entirely in Sterling's hands. I had built that house. I did not need to watch what became of it. I had a workshop. I had my tools. I had Arlo on Saturdays and Sunday dinners with his Yalera and a room at the back of her house with a window facing the old pecan tree. It was enough. For the first time in 2 years, enough felt like abundance rather than subtraction. On a morning in late February, I finished a jewelry box commissioned by a woman on Jones Street, English walnut, hand-cut dovetails, original brass hinges cleaned and reset. I set it on the bench in the early light and looked at it for a while. Then I took down the small box Arlo and I had made together in October. Inside were 2 things Margaret's letter folded precisely the way she folded everything, and the cloth pouch holding the fragments too small to use, which I had kept because throwing them away had not felt right. I read the last line one more time. "Live for yourself, Silas. It's time." I had first read those words in a cold mill at 3 in the morning, with rain on the roof and my hands unsteady. I read them now in a workshop I had chosen and paid for on a morning when the Savannah light came through the windows at the low, unhurried angle it takes in February. And the tools on the wall were mine, and the work on the bench was mine. And the silence in the room was the good kind, the kind that belongs to a man who has finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. My hands were not shaking. They had not shaken in a long time. I folded the letter back along its creases, put it in the box, and set the box back on the shelf. Then I picked up my plane and went back to work. If this family story taught me anything, it is this silence is not the same as peace. I spent 2 years believing that enduring without complaint was a form of love. It was not. It was fear dressed in the language of sacrifice. I am not a perfect man. I signed papers I should have questioned. I protected a son who did not deserve protection. I confused keeping a family together with keeping myself small. If you are sitting somewhere tonight doing the same, stop. You are not honoring anyone by disappearing. I believe God does not ask us to be doormats. He asks us to be faithful to truth, to dignity, to the people who actually show up. Every family betrayal leaves marks that take years to name. I lived inside one for 2 years without fully understanding what it was. The hardest family betrayal to recognize is the one that wears the face of someone you raised. This kind of family story is more common than anyone admits. If you have carried your own family betrayal in silence, leave it in the comments. You may say the thing someone else needed to hear today. If this family story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe if you want more. Thank you for staying until the end. A quiet note: the stories ahead contain fictional elements built for reflection and understanding. If that is not what you are looking for, no judgment, find what serves you. But if you stay, I will make it worth your time.